dial in. And as they're dialing in, please do go into the chat function, say hi, introduce yourselves, write a comment. But whilst we wait, we're going to start with something a bit more personal. I want to know how COVID-19 is affecting your daily routine at the moment. And Pat, if you can hear me, I'm going to start with you, given that today is quite a special day for you.
Yeah, it certainly is. So it's the first day after 14 days that I've stepped outside of my apartment. So I went to the UK a few weeks ago and got issued a stay-at-home notice, just precautionary, mind you. And yeah, today. So I went out for a walk. It was a super strange feeling, kind of like a heightened sense of awareness, and in particular in sound. So it felt like I could hear every single sound around me. So it was a beautiful feeling, but a little bit disorientating. So yeah, I can't wait to see what the day brings.
Nice. Congratulations, Pat. Welcome to the real world. Yinglan, you're not actually sat in front of trees. You are lovely, wearing a suit at the moment, top to bottom, I assume. Tell us about how your daily routine is being affected by the current situation.
Well, I mean, I think on the professional front, we are mostly working from home. I think there's some documents that obviously we need to go to the office to sign. But I think the kids are great. I mean, they are doing a lot of online learning, online education. I think online gaming in the households is at the all-time high. So I think there's lots of positive and also negatives to learn from.
Great. Yeah, that's definitely true. Melissa, how's it affecting you? I know you're in the US at the moment.
I am. Actually, my schedule is pretty much the same. I get up every morning, I go for a run, I get on the phone, I get a little bit of break. It's just reversed. I'm dealing with Asia now in the evenings and the US during the morning hours. I think the only thing really difficult is I miss my puppy.
Yeah, that is true. Finn, stuck here without you. Hian, how are you getting on?
I think I echo everybody's sentiment. I was telling the team that they should be very lucky for two reasons. One is that they're based in Singapore. At least I would say 60% of us are based in Singapore, if not Southeast Asia. And then the other one is that we get management fees as venture capitalists, because 10 years ago I was an entrepreneur going through the financial crisis as an entrepreneur, and we have a great sympathy. So I think professionally we are working harder than ever. Just that the things are different, the concerns are different. And in the evenings, I'm on the phone with US, trying to get as much support to some of the partners and trying to figure out if we can try and organize some community events to get PPE and masks over to the US right now. Ventilators, I've been on the phone calls trying to do some of these very interesting things, which are not part of my day job. So I'm up late. I'm up like 1:30 in the morning talking to people in New York.
Wow. We'll get more into that later. That's amazing to hear. I think we're going to get going now. Thanks everyone again for dialing in. We've got a good number of people on the line now. As you're joining, please do say hi in the comments feature in the chat room. Tell us where you're from, tell us what you do. And we've got about an hour to go now with these illustrious VCs we've got joining you. And we encourage you to ask as many questions as you want during the session. So there's also a Q&A feature at the bottom. So make sure to ask questions throughout. I'm Rebecca, I'm your co-host.
And I'm Pat. So happy Friday and a big warm welcome to everyone. So this is the first of our Green Shoots virtual series, and we're very, very happy to have Melissa Guzy from Arbor Ventures, Hian Goh from Openspace Ventures, and Yinglan Tan from Insignia Ventures. So each of our speakers today brings so much to the table, and we're super grateful that you've made time to join us and share your thoughts with the community. So for everyone out there, please give them a virtual round of applause. So following a number of conversations we've had in the market with fintechs and VCs and the general community about how MAS and the Singapore FinTech Festival can support its community more, we've received so much support for bringing people together in a virtual yet safe way. So that's how the Green Shoot series was born. And essentially the purpose of this and the reason why we're doing this is to kind of provide practical advice and insight during these dark times and provide, if possible, some light relief too. And so we'll be running these every week. We'll be crowdsourcing ideas and speakers. So please, please, please let us know what and who you want to hear about. We've also set up a WhatsApp group, as Rebecca mentioned, so we can hear your voice and try and reflect that into some of these conversations. We'll also be sharing any government and MAS related initiatives to support the fintech community. And we'll kind of discuss this as we go along in each of the series. So my co-host, Rebecca, and I will be leading these interviews with our wonderful VC victims. So I suppose let's kick this off, and let's give each VC a chance to kind of give at least 2 to 3 minutes opening on their background and their current outlook. So I think at this point, I'll hand over to victim number 1, the amazing Melissa.
Thanks, Pat. I guess, you know, I joined Vantage Point Venture Partners in December of 2000, and could never have imagined that the downturn of 2001 was going to happen. So, you know, this is the third downturn that we're seeing. And I think, you know, from a venture capital standpoint, this is going to look a lot like 2001 versus 2008. At Arbor, we've been pretty well prepared for this for the last 2 years. We know we've been long in the cycle. We knew there was going to be a downturn. I mean, no one could ever imagine it was going to be a pandemic that would impact everybody's life around the world. But what we see is, you know, we've been getting our heads around our portfolio for the last 6 or 8 weeks. I think we're actually in really good shape right now, because some of our companies are actually outperforming. Others, you know, we're going to have to see what the business models look like. But we've actually taken the turn now and started to look at some new investment opportunities. So with every downturn and a significant downturn, which this will end up looking, you know, like 2001 or potentially worse, I think the key is to keep this in mind. There is a future. It's a bright future. There's going to be business models that won't be relevant when we come out of this in the new world. But what we see is there's going to be a lot of opportunities that are going to emerge. And for one, you know, we want to back those entrepreneurs and those efforts to build the next great companies. I think we are spending endless hours with our CEOs to provide not only just support on budget and product, but emotional support. Being a CEO is a very lonely job, especially during times like this, and also caring and concern for the families. We do have some COVID-19 cases in some of our portfolio companies around the world. We're doing everything possible. You know, I heard Hian say that he was shipping things to the US. Well, just to show you what the supply chain looked like only 6 weeks ago, when I was in the US, we were shipping things to Singapore and to Asia. And now our colleagues over there are doing it in reverse and trying to send things to the US where, you know, obviously it's very difficult to get a hold of things. So, you know, on one hand, it's a horrible thing what the world is going through. But as a venture capitalist, as an entrepreneur, I'm always an optimist. There's a better world and a new world ahead of us where there'll be some great companies formed.
Fantastic. Thanks, Melissa. And let's move on quickly to victim number 2. Happy Hian.
Good morning. So I echo Melissa's sentiment, so I'll try to add to that narrative. But my background was I went through 2 cycles as well. 2001, I was an investment banker, a junior investment banker. In 2008, I was holding on to a fixed asset business called the Asian Food Channel, with satellites up in the sky, with very 60% drop in advertising revenues for the industry. And I think there was a forging moment for me. So we too knew that things were going to be long in the cycle, as Melissa said, but we didn't expect it to be this bad. And so from our perspective, what the first thing we would do is we would go to all the CEOs. And I think the psychological part of the situation is really critical. So you go to all the CEOs, and for me, at least when I talk to them, I say, look, I've been there, I've done it before. It always looks bleak when you're right in it, but there's always a time when it just turns, and you never know. So you have to be on the safe side. So initially, some CEOs were a little bit more optimistic than I hope, they would take this thing very, very seriously. I think the situation has changed now. So So that's how we approach it. You know, our firm is a very high touch firm. We have 25 portfolio companies and we have 10 investment professionals in every single region. So we've got the resources to really work in some situations, really taking over fundraising conversations. I think we just closed the fundraising yesterday. We hopefully will expect another one done. And across the portfolio, you know, again, some of our B2C players, some of our B2C folks have really been hit hard. We've stabilized that. Not out of the woods yet, but we've stabilized that. And then we've got some med tech, some telemedicine plays that are doing very well. So the one point I would emphasize is that crises like this tend to allow user behavior that has been changing perhaps to accelerate in their change, right? So a lot of people may not have thought about using telemedicine or online groceries. You know, the older generation may not have done the online groceries thing. So I think a lot of these things accelerate user adoption in certain situations, and that's a positive thing. So that's hopefully the one green shoot that we can take from this whole situation.
Thank you very much, Hian. And we'll definitely dig into some of your experiences from 2008, and in particular, some of the tactical insight that's helped you through this, because I think there's a lot of relevance to a lot of the founders out there that are going through this crisis, possibly the first of their lifetime. So that would be super interesting. And then if we move on to our victim number 3, the marvelous Yinglan.
Hi, good morning. I think kudos to MAS for organizing this event. I actually remember, you know, in the last crisis 2008, I was actually in the civil service crafting what was similar to the resilience package, but it's much smaller scale. And I think one of the things we should have done is to have done more industry outreach like this. We have done some closed door session in the past, but I think the emotional support that Melissa was talking about, I think is particularly pertinent to actually talk to some of the folks on ecosystem to get a better feedback. But anyway, so I think kudos to MAS for taking this initiative. But anyway, I'm Yinglan. I started and run Insignia Ventures Partners, which is a Southeast Asia focused venture capital firm. And I think for the past, 4 weeks, we have been actively, doing portfolio management and looking through their books and assessing the impact on them. I think the numbers are roughly the following, right? So on a dollar weighted basis, I think 75% of our companies have roughly, 12 or more months of runway. So I think they're healthy, 12, 18 months of runway. About 10% or so have 10-15% or so have about 6 to 12 months of runway, and about another 10% or so have less than 6 months of runway. And I think we have been clinically, working through with some of these companies in the second and third category to do scenario planning. Assuming what revenue drops 50%, assuming revenue drops more, what are the necessary things that they need to do? So I think a lot of hands-on work in the past few weeks, and I think the CEOs actually have gotten a sense of this is the pragmatic view of the world out there now. We need to really act fast and decisively rather than later. And actually, similar to what Hian said, I think roughly we were looking at our numbers. I think 75% of our companies, have been negatively impacted. But surprisingly, actually, about a 25% portion have been, actually positively impacted. In the sectors of online education, online gaming, online media. Adoption has been great. I think it presents that there's great opportunities even in a time of downturn like this to capture new users, to sort of try out new business models. I think we see some of these industrial titans also do that as well. You look at the Amazons of the world; they're launching sort of free books, Zoom, free services for education. I think a lot of opportunities to be had in this crisis. I think for us, we are very open for business. We just closed our Fund 2, US $200 million late last year. So on one hand, we are
going to come and see you, Yinglan. I'm going to come and see you with some money too.
yeah, let's do that. So I think the great camaraderie among our VC community.
Yeah.
is very heartwarming. I see the many initiatives led by Hian, to help some of our startups in distress to boost their sales. We see some other initiatives to help take care of workers. There are startup staff that have been laid off, or offer some bridge funding. I think all these initiatives are very heartwarming, and particularly I understand that MAS is going to announce some new initiatives tomorrow. So I think great job by the community and the government.
Thanks, Yinglan. What an opening. So you've got Melissa, who's already looking at new investments. Hian's closed an investment yesterday, and Yinglan's just closed a new fund. So these are the guys you want to be speaking to if you're looking for funding. You've each talked a bit about your experience through previous financial crises in the early 2000s and 2008. What are the parallels that you think can be drawn to this situation? Melissa, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think the parallels are lessons learned from 2001. I think Hian mentioned it earlier, which is people in 2001 were quite reluctant to believe what the new reality was. And so we're slow actually to go ahead and make the necessary changes. I see that being very different this time. At least we run a global portfolio, and I would say still the US has been the slowest to react, but I think the rest of the world has reacted pretty quickly, which is our CEOs have done an amazing job of leadership, of reducing burn rates, cutting out travel, hiring freezes, and really thinking about who they need on their team to weather what we think is going to be a 24-month significant downturn in funding, and really reduce budgets anywhere from 23% to 50%. Again, we're here as really emotional support and guidance and a sounding board for the CEOs. But this is going to look like 2001. It's going to be a deep recession probably. It's going to have a lot of impact on the private markets. And I think the one thing that people can learn from 2001 is, and especially Singapore and some newer venture capital markets, is you got to stay the course, right? We got to stay the course. We got to continue to support entrepreneurs. And I think also because it's a small community, getting to know each other's portfolios and helping each other out where we possibly can is going to be extremely important. But the parallels are this for startups and for CEOs. Revenues are going to decrease faster than you can cut your burn rates. And you're going to have to make some tough decisions on people and on initiatives. But it's really for the best and for the longevity of the company if you make these decisions very decisively. That's one lesson that we learned. The second lesson that we learned is that the venture market is a delayed reaction to the public markets. And the public markets will come back first before the venture market comes back. So you got to prepare for an 18 to 24 month, very difficult funding environment. And that's, again, what we learned from back in 2001. And then I think, finally, the highlight is there was some unbelievable companies like Alibaba who emerged from that a lot stronger. And I think I encourage every one of our CEOs to take a moment and try to find some quiet time. I know kids are running around the houses and dogs and you got a lot of noise, but just step back for a couple of minutes and think about what can you do on your product? What can you do in your company to solve the problem of customer who also is facing a very challenging time? And those that can think ahead and really change and mold the company to solve people's problems will come out of this a lot stronger. And we saw this in 2001, and I think we'll again see this out of when we reemerge from this pandemic.
Yeah, and there's a question here about the long-term implications of startups that are based in Singapore. I want to go back to your experience running the Asian food channel and the challenges and the kind of decisions that you had to make through that crisis. Can you share some of the tactical advice that you went through yourself and share as advice to the audience?
Yeah, so it's interesting how Melissa draws the parallels between 01 and 08 and then now. I think the best way of looking at it was sort of 01 and 08 saw perhaps people get ahead of their skis, right? Valuations, expectations in terms of business models, and it was really capital driven. Like, venture capitalists were either giving people too much money, or IPOs were going out of control, or people buying houses significantly geared. The difference I feel is this time, this is a main street, right? So this is not Wall Street, this is Main Street, where you literally see a supply, a demand shock, just an absolute demand shock, right? So Singapore Airlines was not over geared. It was, the stock was not at a high price, but now it's doing a $10 billion financing package. So it's a very different animal. And frankly, I'm struggling with it too, because if you're very purist at thinking about the problems, we've never seen this before, right? We've never seen the entire world just stop. But the assumption that it will never reopen again, I think, to me, by definition, will not happen, because one way or another, the cure has to be less dangerous than the disease, right? This is not an extinction level thing. This is a very, very bad thing. And so governments right now have no choice but to lock down, because they have to try the lockdown. And if the lockdown is too painful, they'll have to try something new. So I think that's the first perspective. So it then comes back to the question that always people ask, which is, how much runway should we be preparing for? And that's a really hard question to answer, because there are so many scenarios. You can paint a scenario where this thing is V-shaped. You can paint a scenario when we're in the doldrums for 2 years. So I tend to not answer that question. I just say, listen, the first thing is, you think that your costs are going to kill you. Actually, your revenues are going to kill you. And that was the first thing that threatened to kill us at Asian Food Channel, when you just see the drop in revenues and the cash burn just go up, because we had portfolio companies that were making break even, making $2 million a month. B2C food business in Singapore dropped to pretty much zero, like 150,000 a month. That's going to kill you. So it's about being dynamic and securing whatever cash flow, being tactical about it. I'm being very honest about it. I say, if you can delay a payment to a supplier, because it's a big supplier to you and they need your business and they can't kill you, delay it. When I was at Asian Food Channel, I delayed my satellite provider up to 6 months of receivables, until the point where the guy wanted to shut me down. And I said, if you shut me down, I'm never coming back on. So let's talk about repayment plan. And so these are kind of like the tactical conversations that I'm having, actual sort of tips and tricks as to how to ransom money out of suppliers. I was talking to the satellite provider. I still remember this 10 years ago, and I said, how am I supposed to pay you when my customers are late 6 months? Like my Indonesian cable operators, my regional cable operators, they're not paying me. So what do you want me to do? I don't have the money, so you have to wait for the money, and your satellite's up there, just keep it going. So that is the kind of attitude and aggression and sort of pragmatism that I've been telling all the CEOs. This is what you need to do in a crisis. You have to just drop all your previous assumptions. Someone said, like, so what's the planning budget that we're going to do for this year? I was like, do not plan a budget. Just secure cash flow. We'll talk about budget in 6 months' time. I'm not going to do a variance analysis on your situation right now. So I think that's just my style, and I get on the phone with CEOs and I just talk to them and I listen to them, and that's what's happening. Now, I know I didn't answer the other startup question. I'm happy to answer that, but I'm conscious of my ramblings, and I want to pass the mic over to other people. But you can answer that question if you want later on.
Sure. But no, please go ahead if you want to continue for a minute or so. Just be interested to hear more about some of the tactical advice that you provided.
Yeah, but before I do that, I want to pass the mic over to Yinglan Tan, who can give us advice about the long-term impact of startups. Since in Singapore, given that he's responsible for getting me in this business almost 10 years ago when I was an entrepreneur, and he came knocking on my door and said, "You got to get back on the ground." So maybe you should tell that story, Yinglan.
Sure. Big fan of Hian. I still remember. I think I was still in government when you were doing Asian Food Channel, and the remarkable grid that you and Maria had when I first met you. So I think kudos to that. I think the environment has changed quite dramatically in Singapore. I think first advice to entrepreneurs is the headline item, other than what Hian said, which I fully agree on, sort of talking to your partners and seeing whether you can secure better payment terms. Is actually in Singapore, you're very privileged. I think the government is very forward-looking. I think the 48 billion resilient package is a very generous one put forth by the Ministry of Finance. And I think the first thing that I would sort of advise Singapore entrepreneurs or Singapore-based companies or Singapore headquartered companies to look at is how you can, secure some of these, programs or grants in this time of need. So that I think would be the first thing. I think the second thing, just to caution, actually what we tell our companies is that I think the fundraising environment is going to get very difficult. I think partly because I think a lot of investors can't do due diligence, right? I mean, they can't travel, it's difficult to, I mean, you can do Zoom, but the effect may not be the same. It's hard to do reference calls. It's hard to, have a face-to-face meeting. I still remember, I think SARS, there was a period of time where people had to, fly to a different city that is not their own city to meet each other, and they, just take out a computer and talk through the deck. So it's not even possible in this current environment right now to fly to a third city, because I think the whole world is in contagion, right? So I think be prepared for, if you're thinking of a fundraise that takes, even with very good numbers, what would originally take three to 4 months would take 6 to 7 months or even longer. So I think if external funding is your option, I think that's one thing you should prepare for. I think the simpler conversation is to talk to existing investors to see, hey, is there option to do a bridge loan? And there was someone that sent me a tweet yesterday, which says that the flat round is the new 3 times up round. So I think the message there, I mean, it's a kind of a joke, but I think the message there is that, be less concerned about valuations going forward. I think concerned about liquidity and getting capital and cash in the bank rather than be too fixated on valuations. And I think what you're going to see is to see terms become a bit more draconian. But I think it's also the time that you will see, where the good and supportive investors are, right? Because I think it's easy for venture capital investors to ride up during the uptime, but I think it's during the downturn where you see really those that, take the extra mile to spend time with you, to support you in difficult times, to walk you through difficulty. I think that's I think when you see the difference between the boys and the men. And I think remarkable, I still remember remarkable grit exemplified by Hian and in Asian food, when he ran Asian food channel. I think there was a difficult time. I think those entrepreneurs who have been through one of these cycles will certainly remember the pain and have the scar tissues. I think the last thing I would say is be very open-minded to new opportunities. It's not all doom and gloom. I think there are very creative models that you can think about. So I was just talking to some, restaurants that obviously took a big hit in the crisis. I was just telling them, hey, is there a way to think about being more aggressive on online delivery, online ordering? Are there more innovative channels that you can think about? I think for online education, I think this is a great time. The way that learning has been transformed, really. I look at my daughter when she first started, I think the study from home 1 day a week. She essentially just took a short walk from the bedroom to the living room and opened up her laptop and started taking classes. In fact, I am taking some more classes on Udemy myself, during this sort of lull period. So I think there are new opportunities that can be had, and I would urge you to also think creatively out of the box to generate new streams of revenues.
Fantastic, great advice. And for those that listened to the FT Partners session yesterday, they had Matt Harris talking about how they've been evaluating with their portfolio companies, and he's been looking at a scale of how vulnerable are you as the first question, and then the second one is how impacted are you, and then has been using that kind of scale to evaluate where his portfolio is today and where it's likely to go in the coming months. And so that kind of one of the questions that I wanted to pick up here is what is the first thing you did out of the gate with your portfolio companies, and essentially what are you still advising, and in particular some of the practical methods that you're advising around cash flow or managing your cash flow without delaying payment. So maybe Melissa, if you could just share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Pat, I actually did listen to the FT Partners with Matt and Hans and Trish and the gang here. I think we did something very similar. I mean, the first thing we did was back in January when we saw what was happening in China. I mean, pretty much picked up the phone, sat down, and talked to all the CEOs. And the first reaction, depending on where they are, was, well, that's in China problem. That's not our problem. And we're like, nope, it's the second largest economy in the world. It's going to have an impact. So the first thing was really to have a discussion. The second thing we did was once those discussions went on and we saw people start to think about the budgets and think about this, we actually did a coronavirus impact summary for our LPs, which looked at it very similar to Matt, which is really a multidimensional. One was the risk of financing and the strength of the syndicate. A lot of investors have not reserved enough capital to do follow-on financing. So that was one area we looked at. We looked at the impact on our own portfolio. And the third thing is exactly what Matt had said earlier in the day, which is looking at the business model and vulnerability. I mean, clearly there's around fintech, there's a lot of vulnerability on anything that requires a balance sheet or third-party lending capital or payment settlement. And I think, of course, then in certain markets, you have the vulnerability of what's happened, as an example, to Robinhood, where they can't keep up with the volatility in the market or the volume, and so they get shut down or for a certain amount of time. We too are looking at these vulnerabilities. And then the question is, on the vulnerability side, is it temporary? Is it technology driven, or is it market driven? If it's technology driven, you obviously need to figure out how to fix that and fix that very quickly. If it's market driven, as an example, if you take SME lending, there are a lot of areas of SME lending that are just going to be decimated globally. And the question then is, but there's going to be SMEs that emerge, especially around e-commerce. I mean, no one is going to depend upon just Amazon, in my view, going forward, because Amazon can't keep up, has shown, at least in the US, it takes 6 days to get food delivery here from them. So they're broken. No one's going to rely upon one vendor anymore in the e-commerce world. There's going to be a lot of new companies starting there. And so do you shift your model from, the brick and mortar, the food and beverage, to e-commerce companies that are going to need exactly, similar types of SME financing that perhaps you were doing for others. So I think the vulnerability is got to be looked at in real detail with a very keen eye, and really with a sense of, yes, we do not know where we're going, but what we do know is that even when the world turns back on, there's going to be a delayed reaction, and we all have to be prepared for that, and our companies need to be prepared as well. So it's a time for creativity in certain markets around fintech.
Thanks for that, Melissa. You picked up on SME lending as being one of the verticals that is most impacted. There's a question from an Aussie here about how do founders think about potential pivots if they're in one of those sectors that are struggling now. And can you share any examples of founders that you've already seen that are approaching that well? So they're in a segment that's suffering and they're thinking very cleverly about how they pivot their business model. Over to anyone who wants to pick that one up.
Yeah, I mean, but I can just answer at least from a little bit, Becca, from Arbor, and then I can turn it over. I know others have, but let's just talk about, first thing is, are you going to continue to lend or not to lend? And if you are, what's your new criteria? Because the credit scoring you were using is not going to be relevant, especially with furloughs. Furloughs aren't going to show up on credit records, but at the end of the day, unless you have a real-time API to payroll providers, you're not going to have a good sense of credit. So credit is going to change quite dramatically. I think then the question becomes, then what do you do about NPLs, right? Losses, and how are you going to manage that book and the payback on the book? I mean, we've already seen, at least in the US and certain countries, taking a very strong position on debt collection, regardless whether you're an individual or an SME. Then the question becomes, who lent you that money? And do you have not only currency exposure, if you take the rupiah against the US dollar, even the Singapore dollar against the US dollar, that's going to be a little bit challenging. But you have to manage those NPLs. Then you can actually, once you get all of that in a nice box and know what you've got, start to think about, how do I shift that business model to the new SMEs that are going to emerge? And will that be possible given my lending capital and given my runway in the business? And we're seeing that's how our companies are thinking about it. First order is get it under control, know what you've got, think, and then the second order is to think about the future once you've got what you have is manageable.
Thanks, Melissa. Same question to Yinglan or to Hian. What's your perspective?
Sorry, what was the question again? I was writing answers on this chat thing.
Hian's getting carried away. What are the verticals within fintech that are most affected? And have you seen great examples of fintech founders that have been approaching a pivot or thinking about how their business model needs to be adapted?
Well, I mean, I think fintech, I mean, we're obviously not as focused as Melissa in the sector. We're very broad. So, you know, if I could just not answer that question and talk more about my broader portfolio, I probably have more to talk about. But coming to that point about thinking originally, we had a B2C food catering business, as well as a B2C food direct business. And like I said previously, the business just got crushed. And I was on the phone probably like 11 o'clock at night. And I said to the CEO, I said, like, if we're going to go into the night, we better just fight. What can you do? I said, you've got so many loyal customers. Send them an email and say, this is the time that we need your help. Like, this is the time that your wallet is the most important thing. Don't order from other people. We're a startup. Give us, you know, 1 day's worth of your orders every week. We will survive. For us, we're not going to be here, and then you won't be able to eat our food. And he laughed and he said, don't you think that's a bit aggressive? Because everyone just thinks that I'm really in that, you know, in that much peril. I said, you are in that much peril. So what's the point? But he made a good point, which is that, you know, people also do not want to do prepayments or borrow money from fintechs if the whole thing structurally is concerned. So I said, look, what we need to do is we need to come together as an ecosystem, and we need to create a campaign that encourages not just, you know, supporting you as a startup, but everybody else. And so about 10 days ago, I started just furiously messaging people at night, and Yinglan saw it, like just like that. I go like, look, listen, we've got to support our startups. We're venture capitalists. We're sitting down here. We should move from triage to now bigger initiatives. And so we started up this initiative in Singapore called supportstartups.com. I called up Vishal, I called up from 500 Startups because he's got much different capabilities than I did. I roped in Cocoon Capital. I'm roping in Yinglan Tan as we speak right now. But I think a lot of his portfolio companies also did give. What we wanted were offers. So we said to everybody, if you have got a good offer, here's a Google sheet, fill it out. Within 24 hours, about 350 offers came through. And the post got shared, not virally, but very, very widely. And now we had a problem where we had to organize this campaign. And so we then spent the next 10 days, we spun up a website, and the website went live 2 days ago. I would say that this website is not designed to generate significant amount of traffic to push into startups. It's meant to be a beacon so that any B2C startup, B2B startup who's giving aggressive promotions can then also say, we're part of the support startup program. It's like a beacon, it's like a Trojan horse for you to say, you should support us, and say it on a platform level, as opposed to saying, oh, you need to support me. Why? Because what's going on? It's like, look, support startups. And that's what we did as a community. We launched it, the website doesn't have any of our branding, but that's kind of like the thinking where if I'm telling my CEOs to throw everything out of the window, then as a VC, I need to throw everything that I do out of the window as well, and then just change and think about things from an organic, very fundamental level from day one. So that's what we've been doing.
Fantastic. Sounds like a great initiative. And well, one of the things that would be good to understand is, have you got any thoughts about the roadmap for this and how you see it expanding?
Okay, very quickly, we now have a lot of people from many different countries that just message me. Some really early, so going like, "This is a great initiative. How do I sign up?" And I'm like, "This is an idea. This is not an initiative yet." And I think in about a week's time, we'll have ironed out a lot of the operational issues and how to answer people's questions. Some people didn't get their offers on, because maybe they're not so compelling. So we'll get a case study together, and I'm going to respond back to Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. Now I've got a request from Japan. And then we're just going to let people take, the code from the website and just fire it up. But we're not going to run it. We want it to be organic, and each person has, a certain chapter where they go and support their own startups. And then who knows? Maybe this thing goes to Europe, to America. It doesn't matter. Point being is that I think it's sorely needed right now. And original thinking is exactly what I'm just telling people. And that's exactly what we had to do in 2008 in the financial crisis. Just throw everything out the window, and then just start from the beginning.
That's great. And I urge everyone to get behind this initiative. The more people that can support it will give it legs and traction to expand as well. So one of the things I wanted to touch upon is last night, so the conversation on the FT Partners session, there was a lot of discussion around back to basics, unit economics. And there were some conversations around, where are the spaces in fintech that are doing well now and have a good chance of holding up? So it would be good to hear all of your thoughts on this, but maybe we can start with Yinglan.
Yeah, sure. I can take that one first, and then also respond to Hian's initiative. I think first of all, really, let me just respond to Hian's initiative. I think that's a great initiative in this time of need. I think happy to support in a more more concerted way. I think a few of our popular companies are already supporting. And actually, just to toss one idea is actually as extension of that, maybe it may be a good idea to consider adding a platform such as this. Just cutting and pasting the chat questions and some of the answers you're answering as a platform for advice for some of the founders that they are going through this as well. I think MAS could take the lead on this to maybe provide a platform to share some of the advice provided by Melissa and Hian.
You mean like a Quora?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think that would be a great initiative. Back to the original question on unit economics and also new models for fintech. I think what we're going to see is what I used to see was a lot of B2C focused fintech companies, right? And I think what we predict might happen is a greater propensity for B2B companies to emerge, because I think they realize that the whole money guzzling, customer acquisition at all costs, the growth at all costs model might change. And I think depending on sort of B2B sales could be more predictable in this cycle. I also want to respond to the earlier question on what we foresee for fintech companies. I think, especially some of the lending companies, I think what we have been advising them is that one, debt capital is going to be scarcer and scarcer to come by. So I think in January we urge them to quickly try to make sure they lock in some of the capital debt financing sources, especially those we are lending out. And as I think one of the key things that will happen is NPL will go up, and I think that makes the book more challenging to fundraise both equity or debt. So make sure, I think, you tighten the screw around the lending parameters, like what Melissa said. And also, I think there's new paradigm being sort of a new criteria for lending. I think that's another key point that we have urged our companies to do. I think the third one is also to react swiftly and decisively, cutting burn. And I think we have seen this being done in very creative ways, not just slashing headcount, but I think we are seeing some of our companies, sort of reduce salaries across the board, but I think they compensate with some ESOP. I think these are sort of moves that are being taken. My one sort of advice to some of these fintech companies is you can cut people, but I think generally try not to cut engineers, because generally it's a scarce commodity. So make sure you keep them. I also think it's a great environment because a lot of great talent is in the market. So I won't be completely closed to hiring, but I think be very open to the right talent, especially if you have a healthy balance sheet, if you're a fintech company.
No, that's great. And I think, Melissa, it would be good to get your views as well. In particular, the spaces that fintechs are doing well now and have a good chance of kind of holding out through this.
I can speak. We have about 28 fintech companies in our portfolio. About 80% of them are B2B, maybe 85%. I would say a couple of companies have had record months. Anything related to anti-fraud, anti-money laundering is performing extremely well. Fraud is at an all-time high, and I think that will continue. So anything in that space we're seeing performing well. Our companies in the capital market space have had some record days due to the volatility, so they've been actually performing well also. We have a company in the US that's the leading leader in digitized debt collection. March was a record month. They've actually now launched a platform called Engage, which not only it really helps for the consumer to manage their debts across multiple credit cards. So there's a couple of sectors that we see in our own portfolio where they just have had, record months in March. We're watching April very, very closely, obviously, because even on the B2B side, we expect some slowdown on enterprise contracts getting signed. But so far, fingers crossed, the portfolio's in pretty good shape. I will say there's a big difference. We see a difference in the portfolio globally. We really don't see much degradation at all in revenue to budget across Asia and B2B right now. I think everything is holding up pretty well. I would also say compared to the US, where I think the US is actually getting hit harder than the companies necessarily in Asia. But I think our sectors going forward haven't really changed. I mean, we're still looking for the next generation of anti-fraud, still looking around RegTech, we're still looking around API integration, we're still looking around inference AI as a major, a major technology for the future. We're still looking around InsurTech. We think there's going to be different types of insurance that could be issued. So overall, I don't think our strategy has changed on the B2B side at all. I think, to Yinglan's point, I mean, we really do believe that the way companies should budget on the enterprise side is whatever you have today, plus any contracts that are in the process of being signed, and then add a 3 to 4 month hiatus where no new contracts get signed, and then start to think about what your revenue is going to look like. And you heard it this morning, on the FT Partners, and I can't reiterate it. And I think Hans said it from NICA. You've got to think about becoming cash flow positive. I mean, there's got to be a plan in place to get to be cash flow positive for any fintech company. But again, I can't speak to the B2C side very well because most of our portfolio is B2B.
Yeah, no, that was super interesting on the comments last night. And I think Tom Stafford also had some interesting points around thinking about what business do you want to be after the crisis, post-crisis, and then work back from there and look at the different scenarios to get you to that point. But just before we move on, I was going to ask Hian if you could just share your perspectives on who are likely to be the winners, essentially, which spaces are holding up now and which will continue to do so potentially.
I mean, it's so hard to tell. I was just talking to my friend at Disney, and she's saying that the kind of consumer behavior changes that they're seeing across their entire media business is phenomenal. I mean, one of the things they did was they had to pull all releases for all the major movies in China, just pull them because no one's going to the movie theater. No one was allowed to go to the movie theater. And then TikTok bought one of their big titles and just streamed it. So I echo Melissa and Yinglan's thoughts that this is a moment that ironically, the business just continues. And if anything, the various changes to the various consumer behaviors are just going to accelerate. So from that perspective, if a lot of people have never tried Zoom before, I guarantee you a lot of people are going to use Zoom going forward. My grandparents are going to know how to use Zoom. You know, these are things that we saw in the 2008 financial crisis. People were still using free-to-air to advertise. They didn't want to use cable, but we were 3 times cheaper. So people started using cable, and then American Express said, hey, wait a minute, this is just as good as free-to-air. And they never went back to free-to-air. So I think there is something about this, you know, certainly on the B2C fintech side, if you're a lending business, you do not have any marketing costs, right? You literally don't have any marketing costs. So a lot of that kind of stuff is really going to change people. And the question I get, this is not necessarily answering the question, but I was just thinking about it when everyone is riffing. The question I get is a lot of founders saying, should I go out and fundraise now? I mean, I have, you know, some money, but shouldn't I get more money now that I've secured the hatches? And to me, this is the worst time to go and ask people for money, like literally right now, the worst time, because people have money. Don't get me wrong, Yinglan has money, Melissa has money. They just don't want to give it to you, right? Because they're holding it and making sure that they're being very careful about it, because they've got their group of people in the hospital. Some people are recovering well, some people are in ICU. We don't want to take another patient on. I mean, this is the reality of how VCs are thinking about it. So I always tell people, I said, look, there are edge cases. So if you have 3 months of runway, you know what to do. Just go out and fundraise. You have no choice. If you've got 24 months of runway, you know what to do. You do not have to go and fundraise. What happens if you've got like 9 months? So that's the thing, that the guys with 9 months are coming and asking me, maybe I should top up. I said, look, listen, wait 30 days, wait 60 days. We are your existing investors. We could put more money in. If it's anything, negotiate with us and everybody else a bridge round now. Let's start talking about it. People will avoid your phone calls, of course, because they look at you and go like, you've got 9 months, I'm not going to talk to you. But I think you start ransoming your existing investors. You start talking very frankly and honestly to your existing investors, because those are the people who had the most to lose, right? So this is what I used to do at Asia Fujian. I'd be like, guys, look at what Singapore Airlines did. Singapore Airlines just did a 75% deeply discounted rights issue. The price was at $9. It went down to $6. Tomasics making sure that everybody puts money in at $3. This is the national carrier. If you don't put money in at $3, they will take the share at $3. So I think that's the kind of tactical advice I'm giving people. Don't try go on a roadshow to go and talk. That's hopeless thinking at this point in time, when people can't figure out their short-term liquidity requirements and you're asking them to make a multi-year, long-time commitment to your business. Doesn't work. So that was what my mind is. I was kind of thinking about everybody else talking about, you know, fundraising and so on and so forth. I shall stop my tirade.
But the one thing I would say to that though is, I actually, we are taking a lot of new calls. I probably have talked to 10 or 12 new companies this week, and I'll tell you why. Because I think getting to know people is just going to take a lot longer, because we have Zoom, right? It's going to be harder to do due diligence. So actually, I don't mind taking calls from startups who are going to need cash 9 or 12 months from now, because I think it's a good opportunity to get to know them and watch them now over a couple month period and see how they perform. I don't think it's a bad idea.
We're taking a lot of calls too, Melissa, but I'm just saying from a pragmatic basis, like if you ask me immediately for money and you've only met me 2-3 times and you tell me, oh, it's a hot company, and by the way, I've got this other guy chasing me, you better pull the trigger. That's not going to happen. So maybe the point is that you got to make long-term relationships. And maybe if you've had long-term, if you knew a guy who, you know, you've been talking to for a couple of years, and maybe the valuation was at a certain point, and now he comes back and says, I've got a window of opportunity. That's, I think the kind of conversations that I enjoy the most, right? Because that's about pragmatism as opposed to, you know, deal making, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Anybody who says I got a term sheet, you have to act fast. I mean, the thing you're going to do is do what you're doing. Just laugh. I completely agree with you. But I do think it's a good time and I do recommend CEOs build relationships, but with the expectation it's a relationship and it's going to take time to build that relationship.
Yeah.
Yinglan, what's your take there? Because you said earlier founders should be looking at getting debt financing, getting equity financing locked in. Do you agree with what Hian's saying?
Yeah, I mean, that was our advice to them in Jan Feb, because those existing conversations, I think, you should do that in. But I think for new conversations, you should do it in order of, I guess, decreasing familiarity, right? I think in accordance to what Hian and Melissa has been saying, talk to people that you know, that you have built a relationship before, who has expressed interest in the past, and then go out from that circle. I think it's very hard to have a fresh conversation with someone that you didn't know or met the first time. I think for debt financing, I think it's actually one observation that I made in 08, which was that the government grants was at a high level, right? They did provide a lot of debt financing support to underwrite some of the risks for the banks to provide funds to SMEs. But I think what happened was at the individual bank teller level. So the individual branch, if there was an NPL, it's still on their track record. It's still on the officers' books. So they are still not very keen to lend out debt for even deserving SMEs. So I think one piece of feedback would be that, hey, how do you leverage some of the resilience package to trickle it down to the individual psychology of the bank officer to let them be more risk-taking in lending out money to deserving SMEs at least. I think that's one piece of observation. I think it's human psychology that, hey, when it's a downturn, they shut everything off. But I think there's truly gems, or I think gems. I think in Hian's case, national treasures like Singapore Airlines that deserves to be offered assistance, right? And I think it's our job to see which are these gems that we should continue to support and grow. I think the other thing is, on a brighter note, it's also important for companies to realize that, hey, it's not just about slashing, burning, cutting. It's also important to make sure that you have enough capability to emerge from the crisis stronger. So I think one thing is, how do you make sure you retain your best people? How do you make sure that it's a good time to reflect on the processes? Are there areas to be streamlined? So when the crisis recedes, you are in a better position to bounce back versus competitors. I think it's also a good thing. Some of your weaker competitors are going to be sidelined, and you're going to. If you are, I think we also seen that companies like Alibaba emerge much stronger, and Tencent emerge much stronger after a crisis. So I think it's a time to see your internal fortitude to emerge stronger after the crisis as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight or observation around capabilities and how fintech should be also considering those aspects. And we certainly will be picking up on that in the next session because there'll be some interesting news over the coming week. And I just want to say I could probably talk to you guys all day long. I think it's been super insightful. But sadly, we're timing out. And but I have one more question for you guys, and we kind of want to leave this session on a positive note. And so, can you share a green shoot story that you've heard or experienced in the last few days or week that you can share with our audience?
I was just talking to the CEO of Razer, who is converting some of his manufacturing lines into surgical mask lines, and I asked him how things, and he goes, there's a lot of people playing a lot of games, a lot of online games, so his services business seems to be doing well, is what he hinted to me, although he didn't specifically say that. He's a listed guy, so he can't say specific things. And then my e-commerce fashion business, Love Bonito, who has a lot of their revenues in Singapore, I checked on them. They just did a big March end of season sale. They're still collecting a fair amount of money. So it turns out that in Singapore, at least, a lot of women folk are sitting at home. Maybe they're stressed out, they're e-learning with their kids, and they're buying clothing. And then I think there's a backlog from the March season sale, and they're making some cash flow. And so I was very encouraged. I was really worried about that one. And that's a green shoot, yeah.
Yinglan, can you share a positive green shoot story?
Yeah, I went to a board meeting last week expecting, numbers of this B2B marketplace called Easy to be, terrible because they do B2B procurement for large enterprises, and I fully expected some of the numbers to drop dramatically in terms of purchases. Turns out, to my surprise, their number quadrupled because all these big companies like Shell was buying a lot of hand sanitizers, they were buying a lot of masks, and they had fortunately secured this supply, I think by accident or by chance prior to this outbreak, and they were the largest supplier of masks and hand sanitizers. So that was, I think that was a positive surprise. I think the one thing I'll leave maybe the audience is that I think this is the time to, especially for entrepreneurs, to really think about, hey, depending on yourself first, before going out to, you know, reach out to investors, because I think investors are also looking at you and how you behave and how you react to a crisis. And if they sense that, hey, you are someone that can withstand a crisis and have the resilience, I think they are more positively inclined to help you. So I think that's one key takeaway, you know, from at least my board meeting with Easy.
Fantastic, very insightful. And Melissa?
Yeah, I would just like to thank all the great entrepreneurs in our portfolio for really doing a fantastic job of getting ahead of it and taking care of their people, as well as looking after their investors and working with us very closely. But really, you know, today, Patty had a record day in Japan, which was fantastic on e-commerce, you know, processing for Amazon. But really, when it comes to Forder, TrueCord, Ever Compliant, Patty and Akulaku, hats off to the entrepreneurs for really doing a great job here and pushing through this. So I think there's a lot of optimism. And I think, you know, the community, the venture community in Singapore, if we can work together, get some of these great companies through it, you know, I think it was referred to as a national treasure, you know, treasures, but, you know, I think there's a lot of optimism and a lot of great leadership examples that are being set in this group of entrepreneurs globally.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to all our panelists for taking part today. I think you're totally right. It's really important that we come together as a community, and we'll be running these sessions every week. Next Thursday, we're running it at lunchtime. We've set up a WhatsApp group too, so you'll see a QR code coming on the screen very soon, so you can sign up to join the WhatsApp group and share your ideas on what you want to hear about, and also register for next week. So please do get in touch and tell us what you want to hear.